Well, what I want to do now is get into the book of Song of Solomon. And I just want to finish Song of Solomon today. And if we get out a little early today, then so be it. Everybody okay with that? I don't want to jump too far ahead. Job's for next week, and we're back on track with the syllabus schedule that you see. So let's open up our Bibles to Song of Solomon. Not that picture. All right. Yeah. A lot of things have been done with the book Song of Solomon. I'm interested in what the free downloads are all about there, with this particular teaching series. All right. I mean, it was a book that was prohibited young Jewish boys under the age of 13. Weren't allowed to read this book, even though it was in the Bible. So it's got a long history of, as you can understand, of interpretation, different interpretive approaches to this book. And I just want to categorize the three primary approaches to the book from the early Jewish interpreters, largely allegorical. So they're going to talk about God's dealings with his bride, a.k.a. Israel, the nation Israel. Similarly, early Christian interpreters also use the approach, the allegorical approach, the relationship between Christ and his bride. Of course, they're going to talk about the church. And then the literal way, more of a literal way, this is where I'm going to land. The progression of a couple in love, which progresses to their wedding night, and then progresses even beyond that for a lifetime of celebrating romance. So that's my basic thesis statement, my interpretive approach to the book. We had a marriage conference when I was in a small church in southern Indiana when I was going to seminary. Danny Aiken was the vice president at the seminary where I was attending at the time, and so I caught him in the hallway and I said, "This book that you've just written," he wrote a book called "God on Sex." This is from now he's the president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, Daniel Aiken. Great guy. And at the time, he had done a few marriage conferences for small churches and small venues. So I just asked him if he'd consider doing a marriage conference. And he did. He came to our church and did a marriage conference for young couples and old couples alike. And it was just a fantastic get-together of all these couples. And here he is. This book was hot off the press. And he's talking, and it's really his commentary on the whole book, Song of Solomon is really what it is. It's kind of got a catchy title, of course, God on Sex, but kind of gets your attention, doesn't it? I think it's still around, but he follows this approach. So I've always appreciated his approach. So a little bit of his approach comes into the discussion that I'll present to you today. So while the book Song of Solomon seems to be attributed to Solomon, sometimes, though, in the scholarly discussion, it may not always mean that Solomon wrote it, or it may just be attributed to a collection of Solomon. But I think, you've got the complication of the fact that we know from history, some of the books that we've looked at earlier, Solomon had a lot of concubines, and in his doing really well at being a great diplomat, foreign diplomat, the exchange of women got to be a little bit of an extreme for Solomon. So the problem with this picture, actually I haven't, this picture here, I don't like this picture because it assumes that Solomon is writing about himself and about his one true love. Out of all those women, there's one. I don't know if we can buy that either. So I think it's probably a better approach to consider. I like the idea of Solomon being responsible for the book, writing near the end of his life. Kind of like what we talked about with Ecclesiastes. And Solomon is recognizing his life of where he missed out on this aspect of what it means to be, married in the context of one woman. And perhaps now he's writing a book in retrospect, looking back on his own life, not about his own life, but perhaps he's writing about a couple in his kingdom, a model couple that he knows. He's writing about a particular couple and using them as an example of God's ideal best for marriage, something like that. And this is again a book like Ecclesiastes. It's a bit edgy. It gets in your face, but it cuts to the quick in terms of what this thing looks like and when it's done right. And what a to think of it that way. Here's Solomon, like David, leaving behind a masterpiece of for all of the couples in his kingdom to read and understand and say, hey, this is what this is the celebration of romance. We're invited to do this as a couple. It's a wonderful expression of the two shall become one flesh and everything after that in the marriage, in the context of a marriage relationship, against all of the pagan confusion that was always around in Israel's day. People were absolutely befuddled and confused where there was not this kind of celebration going on, this celebration of romance in pagan relationships where, spouses were treated as property and, things like this were going on in the pagan way of doing things. It's interesting. It's an interesting idea to think of how radical this book would have been if properly applied in the nation Israel, if really it was possible for pagans to look at Israelite couples, and say, they're radically different, those couples over there across the Jordan River. Yeah, they love each other. They really do. We don't know what that looks like over here because we're all confused over here because we don't have the foggiest idea what we're supposed to do in marriage context. But they do. That stems from the God who they worship and his teaching, his instruction. And they're radically different. I don't know. I'm kind of excited about that idea because, in my own testimony of how I came to know the Lord, that's how I came to know the Lord. That's what got my attention. Christian couples doing it right. I really wasn't that close to that before. I had grown up and, my mom and dad, they were that part of that generation where men didn't really communicate feelings and emotions to their spouses. They didn't talk about, they weren't taught, never instructed in how to celebrate romance in the context of their marriage. He worked hard. He provided for the family. He did all those loyal things, right, that good fathers do. He was my baseball coach and basketball coach and took the family camping and all those good things, that providing for the family and all those experiences that we had. But the challenge was, I think, for him, like so many of the men in that generation. So I grew up with that kind of absent in my own upbringing. And when I got to college and came to know the Lord, I was in the process of I hadn't come to know the Lord yet, but the thing that got my attention was hanging out in the backyards of some of these Christian couples that were in the choir that I had joined as a non-Christian, of all things. I joined this choir, and they started inviting me over to their backyard barbecues after church, and they'd get together and they'd play euchre and cards and all these things, and I just saw how they treated each other. It was like radical. I saw how couples, flirting with each other and loving each other and loving their kids and all of these things, and that got my attention. I said, "This is what I want. Where's this been all my life?" And then I, discover that there's a book in the Bible that celebrates this very kind of thing. So I think that's what we have to do in this account is approach it that way. A literal account, very poetic, very much so. So we have the poetry and the parallelism going on throughout the book in very beautiful language, very poetic, and we'll get to it in a little bit, but somewhat, it's ancient poetry. Pictures and images and how this painting is being filled in with vivid color, we kind of like read it and say, well, that's kind of weird, and he's describing her neck like a tower, weird, it's a long neck, is there what, all these other vivid pictures and a Hallmark type vocabulary, of the day. We have to appreciate for that day and that time, this was how you described beauty and how you communicated your affections and all of this. So, all right, we don't have to elaborate that too much. So, but I don't think this picture is what we have. Solomon's one true love. Like I say, he's looking back on a life of perhaps regret, admitting some mistakes, and he's putting this book together and leaving it for his kingdom, celebrating romance, probably with a couple in mind that he has, maybe a couple that he knows in his kingdom he's writing about. So this is his masterpiece. This is a magnum opus, adding to his collection, King Solomon, I think, with regards to his wisdom. And we start the Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 1, which is Solomon's. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your oils have a pleasing fragrance. Your name is like purified oil, therefore the maidens love you. So you've got the different speaking voices. We're talking about a young Shulamite bride. She addresses the daughters of Jerusalem. You have the lover, the male lover, coming in and speaking. And you have the bride, responding to her lover, and then you progress through, and you've got this kind of this antiphony of voices going back and forth and speaking in a very poetic fashion. But the idea of may he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. What's the movie Princess Bride? What's the Love's True Kiss, or what is it? Love's True Kiss? Yeah, something like that. Isn't it disgusting? I'm sorry. I had I don't know if I've said this before. I've taught at the seminary for a long time, and I talk about this book, obviously, when I was teaching. I'm teaching you all master's students, but I've taught at the college level too. And, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago. I was teaching through all 39 books of the Old Testament and have to cover things pretty quickly. So we dove into Song of Solomon. We started getting into, I started revving up and started talking about what the book is about. And it's a celebration of romance. And in the context of marriage, it even talks about sex. And one girl stood up in the front row. And she stood up and protested. And she said, we should not be talking about this kind of stuff at a Christian college. And she stormed out the room and didn't come back. She dropped my class. And maybe because of me, it was all my fault. She may have left the seminary, the college, I don't know. But when she left, it was like everybody was in a hush. It was like, and I calmly did my thing, and I said, well, let me just say, she's the reason why we need to be talking about this in seminary. It's in the world, and we're not that far removed from this era and this time when Israel was in the midst of all of this this pagan influence, and there was struggle going on during Solomon's time, leading into the divided kingdom. We looked at that history. We know how paganism infiltrated Israel and with a negative influence. So we've got that kind of confusion in our modern time, don't we? We look out the window and we see all kinds of, it's not, people out there don't have the foggiest idea. Romance, what's that? Yeah.
Well, and I think, when it comes to, sexual temptation and, struggling with it, and because, sexuality is pretty pervasive in our culture, I feel like there's a level of, people struggling with, sexual temptation in the church that we're not aware of. And I think like as the body of people, it's not something we ever talk about because it is taboo.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we've ignored it for so long, and there's this very real section of people in our church who are struggling, like, what do I do with this? Like, how do I navigate through this part of life?
Yeah.
And if we really dove into like the Song of Solomon and was like, hey, this is what it's supposed to look like,
Yeah.
I feel like we would be able to help people navigate through that before they fall off the edge of the cliff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, you hit on a few things there. The temptation thing is huge because it's so prevalent and so, with the internet, there's just easy access to all of the yuck that's out there. But with a proper understanding of a book like Song of Solomon, it invites us to have the conversation, like you're saying. So I think that's good, and it's something we ought to talk more about, I think, from the pulpits. I think. Although it's incredibly, for the pastor, sometimes, unnerving, I think, a little bit scary to bring these kinds of things up from the pulpit. I mean, of course, you have to do it appropriately and all of that, but even for the kids to hear the conversation happening at the adult level, I think is important in the right way. Hearing it from the pulpit as a kid, you say, oh, that's an important topic. That's something that I need to value and protect. It's an investment that I'm making in my future. So the battles that I'm fighting now is something that I'm helping my future. So when I'm able to express my marriage relationship in this appropriate way, I don't have all this baggage that I'm bringing into the mix. So I think that's an important message for young people today. But good point. Let's keep going here. So the classic picture, the book is going to celebrate the joy and the beauty and the consummation of love in marriage context, so in the proper context. So I mentioned the idea of the young Jewish boys weren't allowed to read it because of its explicit nature. We can preach it allegorically or symbolically. God's the groom, Israel's the bride, the church, is the bride or whatever. I think that misses the point. And we don't want to skip over the book either. So the challenge here is, I think it's a book if we bring this book properly to our congregations and even our Sunday school classes, we've got an opportunity to put the appropriate emphasis where it needs to be and clear up the confusion muddle that's out there. People don't know what authentic love looks like or what it should look like. But when you see it for the first time, for me anyway, it made a huge impact in my life. Of course, the difficulty is, we've got to be, if we're the messenger of this kind of idea, we've got to have our own life together, our own act together. We've got to be, if we're comfortable enough talking about it, we've got to be able to use our own life as a living illustration of this. We've got to have a happy, romantic marriage relationship. It's maybe difficult for some to stand in front of a Sunday school class or a congregation if they know that their own marriage they're struggling a little bit in this area. It can be, in ministry, it can be a struggle. We've got some ideas over the years. We've talked about the celebration of romance and helping husbands, learn. I speak of the husbands. The husbands are the bad guy here, right? But I think I speak to the husbands because they're the ones that need to probably lead the charge in the context of their marriage relationship. They're the ones that need to take the initiative. If there's some motion that has to happen with regards to the cultivation of romance. My wife and I have talked about the love languages. It's a great little book by Gary Smalley. If you've not ever used it in ministry, it's a great little tool for introducing a couple to the language of how do you talk about love? How do I express love to you? And the different categories of the love languages. Some people speak the love language of gifts, or just time, or words, or acts of service, or touch. Some, you talk about the love languages and you ask your spouse, what's your love language? And then you practice speaking that language, right? You use that language to express your love and affections towards your spouse. So I think Smalley does a pretty good job of that. Have anybody ever used that in ministry effectively? No? The love languages?
Yeah. Not the book itself, but the...
You're familiar? You're familiar with it? Would you agree it's a pretty insightful?
Can relate to each other.
Yeah.
And not selfishly.
It builds a conversation. It can be a great challenge. I've used it a couple times in premarital counseling, and it helps couples establish a foundation of, and it turns the light bulbs on, so to speak, when you start recognizing, and for the frustrated husband, it may be a way of helping him understand that I give my wife gifts all the time, and she just never seems to appreciate. She tells me that I never tell her that I love her, but I'm buying her things all the time. I keep buying her things. And he's frustrated and she's frustrated. And then you turn on the key and you say, all your wife likes is your time. And all of a sudden, the conversation changes. I've started spending time with my wife, and boy, I don't have to buy her gifts anymore. It's just spending time with her. Now she just knows that I love her. It's a revolutionary, boing, moment. Or, I've just started touching my wife more, hugging her, and little hugs in the morning before I go off to work. And, wow, the magic happens now, it's just a revolutionary change. So these can be powerful things, acts of service, And I challenge when I talk, I can talk to you guys too, but, I've oftentimes challenged my college students, especially the guys, a lot of them are, looking forward to being married down the road and all of this, and the kinds of things that you may have to do to be that man, to be the real man. Real men watch Downton Abbey with their wives. Let's just say it. Let's get it out on the table. This is the kind of thing. It's a series. It's run its course, but we watch Downton Abbey every episode multiple times for our date nights. And this was my wife's love language. One of them is time. So we spent time watching the shows that she liked. So you need to be willing as a male to sit down and do the romantic thing, whatever it may be with your wife. What is it that helps to cultivate the romance? For my wife, she loves to watch these episodes, and yes, Pride and Prejudice. And even this, the Colin Firth version. There's multiple versions of Pride and Prejudice that you have at your disposal. You can watch all of these episodes to be that, find the romance. Not this episode, not this version. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. You don't have to watch that one. Or maybe this one, but I don't really like this one too much. It's Pride and Prejudice. It's the Bollywood version of Pride and Prejudice. But really what we're talking about here, I know I'm a little bit off of the book and so much in the text, because when you read Song of Solomon, every chapter is pretty much like the one before. I mean, it's really, it's a lot of the same kind of description. But the question that I want to ask, and this is a good question that if you wanted to think about how you might preach and teach this in your ministry, is how do you find the romance in the everyday? I love this aspect about Dr. Aiken's book, and at the marriage conference that he did for my church, he talked about it this way. Couples, it's like you're playing a game. It's finding the romance. It's like something's hidden in your house, and you have to go find it. It's something that you have to find every day, and that's the game. He talked about, he gave some really humorous examples of finding the romance. It's so if you just understand that this romance, it's something that's cultivated. Think of it that way. So you're planting a garden and you're having to deal with the weeds. You're having to pull out weeds. You're having to give some fertilizer and tend to it. It's the cultivation of romance is really what we're after. This is what the book Song of Solomon it illustrates this as an entire book. It's, of course, I think the bride, the Shulamite bride, her love language is obviously words, and the groom obviously has it because he continues to describe her beauty in a lot of different kinds of ways. But let me just show you how this game is played out. Some of these are for the guys, some of these are for the girls, but finding the romance can be thought of as like a game of hide and seek as well. And I'm going to show you a series of pictures, and you're going to tell me, where's the romance in this picture? All right, you ready? You ready? Here's the first one. Is that could be a little romantic, couldn't it? Yeah. So you're the man of your dreams. You wake up and he's out there cleaning up the kitchen. Romance is hidden. The hidden romance. So you find the romance. It's like, oh, for some women that's like, this is obviously an illustration of acts of service. He is doing something for his spouse, and for his spouse, this becomes, this great source of romance. It's a celebration of romance. He's finding the romance by doing this. When we go on vacation, my wife loves it because I cook all the meals. And I love to cook. It's like my love language. I mean, I love my cooking, and everybody does too. So it's kind of fun, that way. But here's another one. Here's Mr. Romance and helping his kid, learn how to clean the house. Here's another finding the romance. I don't know if these really communicate well, but reversal roles. Here's a woman, doing something that maybe, he taught me how to do this, and now I'm doing it. I'm checking my oil. Guy comes out and says, "Oh man, honey, you're looking pretty good today. I don't even care what the oil level is." Anyway, I'm just being funny. But here's the progression that I appreciate. This getting back to the text, and I emphasize this in this way for my college students largely, but it's important to know. I think the progression lines up pretty well. You've got a progression of the relationship that we see in the entire book from beginning to end. So you start with, and here you've got a couple in love. So there's the attraction phase, and then you go into the dating phase, you might call it, and courtship. There's the continuous progression. Then you've got the wedding in chapter 3, verse 6. And then the wedding night, which begins in chapter 4, verse 1, all the way through 5:1. And that's really when the relationship, in terms of the sexual relationship, is consummated, wedding night. And then you've got some normal things that happen with a normal couple. You talk about, navigation skills. You've got conflict in chapter 5. You've got resolution, I think, there, and then ongoing romance is celebrated in chapter 7, and finally an affirmation of one's commitment to the other. So I like this progression, and it kind of, I think it fits well with the text. But the literal aspect of the book, we see the caricature come from the description in chapter 4. We have to recognize that what we're reading is beautiful poetry, and in images and pictures that would have communicated in that day and in that language. These are pictures of what beautiful looks like. All right? So I'll read it. You can see where this picture comes. In chapter 4, verse 1. Sometimes I call on a guy to read it, but I'm not going to embarrass anybody. I'll just read it. "How beautiful are you, my darling? How beautiful are you?" He's celebrating her romance. He's celebrating the romance. He's describing her beauty. So what's this beauty look like? Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. So it emphasizes the whiteness of her eyes behind her veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats that have descended from Mount Gilead. Now her heart's starting to patter here, right? I mean, not like this picture. There's the goats flocking down, you know. But anyway, that's the color version on the left there. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes, which have come up from their washing. She's got white teeth, which probably in the day was a good thing, because maybe dental health was not as accelerated as it is in a modern time. So for her to have white teeth was a real blessing. All of which bear twins, and not among them has lost her young. Are we still in the teeth verse? Yeah. See, she's got all of her teeth, right? She's not lost any of them. That's good. Your lips are like a scarlet thread, so they're red. And your mouth is lovely. Your temples are like a slice of pomegranate. So your rosy cheeks, you know, pomegranates, red, 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 behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with rows of stone. There you go. Her neck. And in that day, one's neck was, you know, a woman's neck was considered beautiful in terms of its straightness and length, and it's something to be admired. On which are hung 1,000 shields, verse 4, all around shields of the mighty men. Your two are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle, which feed among the lilies until the cool of the day, when the shadows flee away. I will go my way to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. You are altogether beautiful, my darling, and there is no blemish in you. Now, you know, what we do as dudes, as married men, is we describe the beauty of our wives in terms that she would appreciate and understand. We celebrate the romance by learning how to speak her love language and, you know, practicing that and every day and finding the romance, because it's kind of like a game of hide and seek. And so this is the thing that we do. We cultivate this. This is the intimacy and the romance that we cultivate and celebrate, and it's not something that dies when you become 55 years old. You continue on down the road into your glory days. It's something that's an ongoing as a couple in love. It's not something that becomes stagnant when you retire, you know. And there's a celebration of romance that this book invites us to continue to pursue. All right, so there's a lot of other things that happen in the passage. Like after the wedding night, you've got the bride over here in chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 4. She's giving advice to the younger women who are unmarried, I think, in this context. In verse 4, I want you to swear, O daughters of Jerusalem, do not arouse or awaken my love, or do not arouse or awaken love until she pleases. Who is this coming up from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved? Beneath the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she was in labor and gave you birth. So, you know, it's poetic and all of that, but don't arouse the idea of, you know, there's a time for the arousing of your love and the consummation of marriage and all of those things. So I think it speaks to the kind of the progression that we have. Chapter 6, verse 3 is really a statement of the commitment. This is after the wedding. So this is where has your beloved gone, O most beautiful among women? Where has your beloved turned, that we may seek him with you? My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of balsam, to pasture his flock in the gardens and gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine, he who pastures his flock among the lilies. So I've got that written on my ring right here. Ani la dudi li in Hebrew. So it's kind of a statement of commitment. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. So does your spouse know, speaking as the guy, that she's the only one? You know, she's yours. You know, she is yours. She knows that. Does she know that? Have you told her lately? Those are the kinds of things In chapter 7, we've got more admiration. This is even after the wedding night. I think the wedding night happens there in chapter 4 and the consummation and all of that. But he continues to admire her, and some of the same kinds of language that we saw before in chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. I don't think I need to read all of that. It's a lot of the same kinds of things, but it's very, very romantic how he uses words and pictures to describe how he feels about his wife, and now how he is able to admire her full beauty in all of its various facets. So this is a celebration of romance, a couple in love. I was Googling the world's most romantic movie scene. What come to your mind if you think of the great classic romantic movies? Anyone come to mind?
Would it be Princess Bride?
Princess Bride?
Wouldn't go with that.
What part of it?
When they kiss.
Oh, yeah, Princess Bride. I guess that's the movie of all movies, right?
I'm just trying to guess what the world's number one is.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. There's this classic scene, and
Oh
my God.
I know. Not very loud.
Hold on to the railing. Right. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes closed. Trust me.
The most romantic scene ever made.
Your eyes.
If the movie only ended there, right? No, it's another way to look at it to encourage your couples, the married couples in your congregations and your Sunday school classes. It's the challenge of celebrating the romance. It's like we're making our own movie, a romantic movie. And as the world watches, again, I think that there's a real evangelistic and apologetic to be made with regards to how we can show off our marriage to the watching world. We can use that as a powerful evangelistic tool. Couples who have their act together and are able to, when you see a couple in love, you just kind of, oh man, they're really in love, and you kind of see it. But people are watching that stuff, and there's confusion all over the place with regards to that. But I think it's a powerful, and I think it's intentional that Christian couples ought to be on center stage with regards to people watching and saying, yeah, that's what it looks like, because they haven't the foggiest idea what it's supposed to look like. And so I think we can use that and help, help our congregation and the couples in our congregations do that as well. Consider that as a something to strive after. But so there's a lot of things that we can do with the book Song of Solomon in our preaching and teaching ministries. So, well, I'm going to cut us a little short today, just as I promised. I'd really want to save the book of Job for next week and not get into it. We covered a lot of ground today with these two books. And so let's go ahead and wrap up for today. All right, thanks for your attention.